Da-na-na-na.
Camera obscura means dark room. That's all it is. So if you have a room with no light and you poke a little hole in the side of that room and you let light in from the outside, by miracle, you'll have an image projected upside down, turned around, but in color and moving on the other side of the wall.
It's a phenomenon that people have been aware of for thousands and thousands of years. It's easy to do. It's very often the first project that is taught in photography classes, just as a way to get people to understand the simplicity of what the camera is.
Later improvements of the camera obscura included putting a lens in the hole so that the light could be focused, so that you would have a brighter and more focused image that would be projected on the wall.
Rick Schulze is a German professor. And in the case of Schulze's experiment, what you have is a glass jar, and it's filled with chalk. There's some nitric acid, and there's some silver. It's sparingly sensitive to light. So you have this jar with a barrier around the outside, and when light goes through the stencil, it then darkens the chalk that is facing the glass on the inside of the jar. And this is where Schulze contributes to the evolution of photography, is that he's proving that this is done by light and not by heat.
I think it's impossible for us today to imagine what a revelation the first photographs would have been to people, these mirrors with a memory, to record things that looked just like what we saw. People's ideas of time changed completely. For the first time, you would know what your grandparents looked like, even if they died before you were born. To see this process make its place in the lives of ordinary people is, to me, the most exciting thing about it. It changed everything.
Niepce. What he discovered was that asphalt was sensitive to light. He painted the solution on a piece of glass and put an engraving on a piece of paper on top of that, and where the light shined through and exposed that asphalt, it hardened. If you put that piece of glass with the asphalt into a solvent, it will remove the areas that weren't hardened. The earliest photograph we know is on a piece of pewter made by Nicéphore Niepce. It's a view from a window. It's from the 1820s, and this image made by asphalt still exists. So that's the invention of photography.
Now photography is so ubiquitous that we probably don't think about how special and magical that experience was.
The calotype process that he invents in 1840 allows him to make a little bit of an exposure. So now he can put this into a camera and actually do pictures of living human beings. He can then make photographic negatives and expose that to light. And so he has negative and positive. He essentially introduces the negative positive potential for photography that becomes the standard of photography until the invention of digital photography.
Up until photography, only the very wealthy who could afford to have portraits painted had any notion of what their ancestors looked like. Photography was used primarily for portraits because people is what we are primarily interested in. We see it as a very popular way to do what we've always wanted to do, which is to record the features of people we love.
1878, Edward Muybridge, an English-American photographer, was commissioned to take some pictures of a horse. What he produced was this. The images were taken for a scientific study into the gait analysis of a galloping horse. The participants were interested in whether or not all four horses' feet come off the ground at once while moving at speed. Little did Edward Muybridge know he had just created what would widely become known as the first ever moving image. Shortly after the images were taken, Muybridge discovered that while projecting the images in quick succession, this happened. What you're seeing is the horse in motion, widely considered to be the first ever movie. This got people interested. For the next few years, inventors from all over the world jumped on this newfound technology. Filmmakers such as Thomas Edison, yes, that Thomas Edison, and the Lumiere brothers were seen as pioneers in this new technology. The early 20th century is when films began to take on a more narrative role. With filmmakers such as Georges Méliès in France and Edwin S. Porter in the USA, more complex films with refined storylines and detailed characters began to emerge. Notable movies of the early 20th century include A Trip to the Moon, The Great Train Robbery, and The Birth of a Nation. Yeah, that last one was controversial.
But not to
28th U.S. President
Woodrow Wilson would firmly establish its reputation as an unreconstructed Southerner after he hosted the screening of a film at the White House during the winter of 1915. That infamous picture was titled The Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith. The 3-hour saga, fictionalizing the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, was a pioneering artistic achievement in the history of cinema. But it was also a monumentally racist piece of lost cause propaganda. It sought to transform the Ku Klux Klan from terrorists into heroic vigilantes, protecting the country from the perils of racial equality.
Birth of a Nation marked not only the arrival of a new medium of communication, and that being cinema, but the way that that new medium could be deployed to further the old biases of American society. And African Americans immediately recognize what the dangers are implicit in this. It's not coincidental that there's a scene in which there's a young white woman who is being pursued by this rapacious black man, it's actually a white actor in blackface, and she hurls herself off of a cliff rather than be so defiled. This was meant to strike directly at a peculiar part of the psychology of white men of the South and beyond, and them understanding that their fundamental role in life was the protection and preservation of white womanhood from black people.
The Birth of a Nation, it really is this amazing, big, gigantic, epic film that fixes a certain story of the Civil War and Reconstruction in the minds of the American public. And that story is that black people were too lazy and ignorant to fully master the citizenship that they were offered by Reconstruction.
There's a series of scenes in Birth of a Nation that are supposed to be taking place in the South Carolina legislature during Reconstruction. There's a title card that says this is a facsimile of something that really happened. And then it shows black legislators doing all of these things that are kind of desecrating any kind of dignified political process. They put their feet on the desks, they're eating fried chicken, they're swigging out of a flask. It's, to me, one of the absolute worst of the many horrible scenes in Birth of a Nation because it's denigrating everything to do with African Americans' entry into politics. And it's reinforcing this idea that the entire Reconstruction experiment was a disaster, was a mistake. And the reality is, of course, that was not how it was.